Hello participants, and thank you for joining us today. We're just having some last-minute technical glitches, and we just would ask for your patience, please, while we sort those out with one of our panelists. In about 15 seconds, I'll come back and welcome you formally to the webinar. So please bear with us. Thank you. Jerry, this is Stephanie. I'm the facilitator for this afternoon's webinar. We can hear you, although it's very quiet, but what I'm asking now is if you can please go on mute so that we can begin the session. And when I come to the part in which you're the speaker, I will cross to you. We are unable to mute you at the moment for some reason. If you could please mute yourself so that we can begin the session, I would appreciate that. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. My name is Stephanie Speck, and I'm the Chief of Communications for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's really lovely to have you here to join UNDRR and OCHA, who are together co-hosting today's very important webinar in which we launch the recommendations and checklist on scaling up disaster risk reduction in humanitarian action. And today's event is part of the overall worldwide Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week. We're very pleased that you could join us, because today we're going to review and discuss a very concrete set of recommendations that target you, our participants, who are humanitarian action stakeholders, and in which outline specific actions that help us to better integrate disaster risk reduction into humanitarian action, including identifying various multi-hazard risks and incorporating risk reduction throughout the phases of the humanitarian program cycle. The checklist and recommendations that we're launching today have been developed through a consultative and participatory process with you, with key humanitarian and development partners. The first edition has just undergone pilot testing with OCHA in Haiti and Pakistan, and piloting is still being finalized in Bangladesh with the resident UN Resident Coordinator's Office there. So we have quite a lot ahead of us today for the next 90 minutes, but what we've tried to do today is not just subject you to a panel of talking heads, but because you're our partners in this endeavour, we'd like to invite you to participate fully in this webinar. And there are two ways in which you can do that. The first is by using the question and answer box, which you can see on your WebEx screen now. It's not the chat box, it's the question and answer box. And if you hover or click on the chat box, you will have the option to come to join the question and answer. I, as a facilitator, keep my eye on that box, and I'm very pleased to ask the questions that get asked there to our panelists today. Often we get given more questions than we can deal with during the 90 minutes, but I'll try and move through as many of those as possible. So please put your questions there. The second way in which you can participate today is through your phone. If you have a phone on you, you're very welcome now to get your phone out and to go into your internet browser and type www.menti, and that is MENTI, I for India.com, www.menti.com. These details are being put in the chat box now, and enter the code 8147466. I'll say that again, 8147466. That is a code that gets you into a participatory question and answer tool, which will analyze and aggregate results and allow us to take the temperature of what you think as our audience today. You can use that on your phone, and you'll also note that during the webinar, you will also have an opportunity looking on your screen to click yes to a multimedia button, and that will take you through to the same area in which you can answer a question, and we will see what you're saying on the screen in front of us. It may sound a lot of information to take in at the moment. I'll remind us of this process as we go through this afternoon's webinar. But please, if you have a phone, open that now or join us through the screen, and you'll see that when the moment is right. Without further ado, I'd really like to kick off today's launch by inviting Mr. Ryan Paulsen, who's the Director in the Humanitarian Coordination Division for OCHA, who will provide us with our opening remarks today. Over to you, Ryan.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Colleagues and friends, I'm delighted to be here with you today, joining this group for this all-important event. The launch of this checklist to scale up disaster risk reduction recommendations, excuse me, and recommendations developed in consultation with so many of you is extremely timely. Over the past 2 weeks in the HMPW, we have heard speakers and participants, I know you have as well, engaged passionately on a range of topics, from early warning to recovery, using satellites to household surveys, all with the aim of improving the systems we now work in to address growing humanitarian needs while trying to avert new crises. The checklists and recommendations synthesize and bring together in one place so many of the elements spoken of: readiness, risk analysis, anticipatory action, accountability to affected populations, importantly, humanitarian financing, and more. In high-risk countries where we often already have a significant humanitarian presence, and we know that a disaster is about to strike, why should we wait for the suffering and see what we can do about it after the fact? If we know a disaster is about to occur, it is our humanitarian imperative to do something now, immediately, to mitigate the shock for the most vulnerable people. At OCHA, we facilitate a collective anticipatory approach across the humanitarian system. And in this context, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Mark Lowcock, last year announced an investment of up to $140 million from the SURF to help us collectively scale up. And thanks to the excellent work of many of you and your organizations, participants on the WebEx today, we have more and more proof that anticipatory actions work, definitive proof that anticipatory actions work, that they are faster, that they are more efficient, and importantly, that they are central to enabling a more dignified response to crisis. By acting earlier, not only do we avert and mitigate humanitarian need, but we also allow people to protect their hard-won development gains. Let me refer to 2 examples. In Somalia, we learned that acting early ahead of the triple threat of locusts, floods, and COVID-19 meant that disease outbreaks such as acute watery diarrhea and malaria were reduced compared to similar experiences in the past. By upgrading boreholes earlier, we improved household finances, boosted mental health, kept livestock healthier, reduced disputes related to water sources, and mitigated displacements. In Bangladesh, ahead of some of the worst flooding the country has seen in decades, we reached more people faster and at half the cost. We found that women and girls who received dignity and menstrual hygiene kits in advance were more likely to access regular health care, to continue school, generate income, as well as participate in social and community activities compared to non-recipients. An independent evaluation of the Bangladesh pilot found that recipients of anticipatory action were more likely to evacuate families and livestock and lost fewer productive assets. Beneficiaries of anticipatory cash transfers were less likely to borrow, and when they did, they borrowed at lower interest rates. These are just 2 examples which demonstrate how, by using risk analysis to deliver targeted humanitarian assistance at the most vulnerable, not only does this have an immediate life-saving effect, but also a long-term developmental impact. And these examples also demonstrate how, by working together, collective anticipatory action can provide more effective outcomes. I would also like to point out that over the last few years, OCHA has worked closely with IASC partners on strengthening guidance on humanitarian programming, namely the Humanitarian Programme Cycle, which results in the publication every year of humanitarian needs overviews and humanitarian response plans. Many improvements have been made, including an emphasis on risk analysis, taking into consideration climate and seasonal forecasts, conflicts, and projections of people in need. However, we recognize more needs to be done, and the recommendations and checklists are a strong and specific complement on how we can do this. Think about the emerging challenges and crisis in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, for example. We know the risks and vulnerabilities that communities face. So now we need to support both humanitarian and development partners to take action immediately to stem the rise in humanitarian need. But this also requires capacity, partnerships, and resources. To scale up the approach outlined here, we require, first of all, more investment in predictive analytics, risk monitoring, and early warning systems, especially at the local level. Secondly, we need more pre-arranged financing. For the humanitarian community, this means an expansion of flexible, coordinated, and predictable financing for anticipatory action. This means allowing existing and new humanitarian funding to be used in a flexible and anticipatory manner, as well as more funding to existing humanitarian pooled funds. And thirdly, we need to start the process of mainstreaming anticipatory approaches in our humanitarian development and DRR communities. This includes supporting national authorities to include those approaches in their respective disaster management toolkits. There are a few opportunities ahead where we can pitch these messages together. For instance, most of our colleagues are already collaborating as part of the Crisis Lookout Coalition, advocating that the G7 governments act on these issues. We can also collaborate more in the run-up to COP to advocate for this approach. And this brings me to the heart of the matter on why we are here today during the HNPW, the need to continue increasing dialogue and building partnerships. There is a need to increase awareness, to build capacity and learn together to effectively scale up risk-informed humanitarian action, including anticipatory action, in the rich ecosystem that is the development and humanitarian sectors. And only then can we realize a system-wide shift towards a more holistic, effective, and integrated disaster management system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I found your opening salvo very compelling. Why should we wait when we know that acting in advance works and is successful, alleviates humanitarian need and helps people, secure people on a pathway to safety, security, and prosperity? Thank you for those compelling reminders. I'd like now, please, to introduce Ms. Paula Albrito, who is the Chief of Intergovernmental Processes, Interagency Cooperation and Partnerships for UNDRR. And Paula, I believe you're going to run us through the checklist and recommendations and how they can help us improve our DRR and humanitarian practice. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Yes, I will do so in a very succinct manner. First of all, it is a great pleasure to be with you today and to brief you on the recommendation and checklist on scaling up disaster risk reduction in humanitarian action. Next slide, Jeannie, please. As a very brief reminder on why we have launched this initiative, the scale, complexity, and human cost of today's challenges makes reducing risk and vulnerability central to reducing humanitarian needs. In many humanitarian contexts, population already impacted by conflicts, civil strife, pandemics, or other disasters are also confronted by growing hazards related disaster risk. This is often fueled by climate change. As you can see reflected in the slide, reality is that new risks are becoming and are being created faster than we can tackle existing ones. Humanitarian needs are growing, and so is the funding gap. Underlying vulnerabilities are compounded, and capacities are limited. Short-term solutions are ineffective in reducing and dealing with the consequences. Next slide, please. This has been the rationale for the development of the recommendations and the checklist on scaling up disaster risk reduction in humanitarian action. These documents were developed through a set of global and regional consultations with a wide range of humanitarian and development actors. Today, we are launching the piloted informed and additional global consultation version. The work responds to increasing call for practical tools to risk-inform humanitarian action and strengthen humanitarian development collaboration at the country level. The checklist addresses how to scale up disaster risk reduction in a wide range of humanitarian contexts at both global and country level. It is, as already mentioned, a complement to the detailed Humanitarian Programme Cycle risk analysis guidance developed by OCHA and IASC partners. It is important to emphasize that risk-informed humanitarian action is not about strengthening already strained humanitarian funds. As also already mentioned, we need additional funding and innovative financing for disaster risk reduction. But a risk lens needs to be integrated in the humanitarian response from the start. Next slide, please. The piloting of the checklist in Pakistan and Haiti, and in collaboration with the Resident Coordinator's Office in Bangladesh, allowed to bring to light some challenges, opportunity, and good practices. Initial findings indicates that Pakistan has gone quite far with a high level of risk knowledge and data in the country. The challenge, however, was finding the space to feed this risk knowledge into the Humanitarian Programme Cycle. A new working group was established under the leadership of the Humanitarian Coordinator to support the integration of disaster risk reduction and development into the Humanitarian Programme Cycle. This has allowed better engagement of disaster risk reduction actors in the process. In collaboration with the START network, the humanitarian country team is now exploring opportunities to incorporate anticipatory action in the humanitarian response plan. In Haiti, there's been strong engagement of disaster risk reduction actors, including governments and NGOs in the humanitarian program cycle. The multi-year humanitarian needs overview and the humanitarian response plan provide opportunity to strengthen humanitarian development collaboration around disaster risk reduction. The development of a common work plan could help seize opportunity to strengthen risk analysis and risk-informed planning even further. And as an overall, and perhaps the most important conclusion, the checklist is a useful tool, but there is a need to enhance capacity in order to implement it. Next slide, please. To gain a better understanding of how risk is integrated in the humanitarian planning processes, UNDRR, in collaboration with OCHA and a wide range of partners, recently reviewed how disaster risk reduction and risk is included in the 2021 Humanitarian Needs Overview and the Humanitarian Response Plan. We looked at 12 Humanitarian Needs Overview and 11 Humanitarian Response Plans. It emerged that risk is on the agenda, more so than it was a few years ago. Most humanitarian needs overviews looks at a wide range of hazards, while most humanitarian response plans have a strategic objective related to building resilience. So there is some progress. But more progress needs to be made in deepening the risk analysis, looking at the wider data sources, and ensuring that the risk analysis is actually linked to the clear risk mitigation action in the humanitarian response plan. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the next steps of the initiative. If you're looking, and we are looking for examples on emerging good practices and more detailed tools to accompany the checklist. These are reflected in the recommendation and are going to be made available on the prevention web. We need to further enrich this. We are also looking forward to continue the rollout of the checklist at the country level with partners, supporting further integration of risk in humanitarian policies and guidance, and also strengthen risk information across the development and the humanitarian context, as well as advocating for financing that can help scaling up disaster risk reduction. As a final word, I would like to thank all the partners who have been part of the development of the checklist so far, and who have shared a wealth of good practices, tools, and ideas. This includes also the IASC Result Group 4 and the UNDRR Focal Point Group, and a much wider range of partners at the global, regional, and country level. We look forward to working with you on the next steps. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Paola, and I hope that our guests here today agree that this is a set of very interesting recommendations and guidelines, and we're going to delve further into those as we move through the webinar today. But before I introduce our panel members and speakers, I'd like to check where you're from, where our guests are from, which country in the world are you joining us from today? Ali, if you don't mind sharing your screen. And for our guests here, you can see that you can use your phone to join www.menti.com, or on the right of your screen now, you should see something called a multimedia viewer. And if you press continue, that takes you to a browser where you can also answer the question. So multiple ways you can participate. So I can see that we're being joined from Chile, from Senegal, Nairobi, Haiti, Bonn, France, Berlin, Laos, Quebec, Canada, Malaysia, Australia, shout out to Australia, London, Poland, Bangladesh. I hope some of your eyes are better than mine because some of the very, very pale writing, I'm struggling. Italy, Iran, China, United States. Oh, how fantastic. Geneva. It's great. It really is the United Nations virtually here today. Thanks very much. Ali, you can stop sharing your screen now, and you'll see that screen that we use through the speakers' presentations as we move through the webinar today. And let me introduce our speakers for today. We have joining us Ms. Aisha Jamshed, who is the Country Director for Welthungerhilfe in Pakistan, and also the Chair of the National Steering Committee for the START Network. Welcome, Aisha. We're joined by Dr. Thomas Zahneisen, who is the Humanitarian Director for the German Federal Foreign Office, and also by Dr. Nurun Nuhar, who is the Joint Chief in the Planning Commission and Project Director for the National Resilience Programme in Bangladesh, and Mr. Jerry Chandler, who's the Director General in the Directorate General for Civil Protection in Haiti. We're really very pleased to have all of you with us and for your generosity and time in sharing your skills, experience and perspective with us today. I'm going to start first with Aisha. Aisha, if you can unmute and turn your video on, that would be great. As I said, you're joining us in your position as Country Director for Welthungerhilfe and also looking after the START network in Pakistan. We know that Pakistan is among the most disaster-prone, climate change affected countries in the world. We know that water is a critical issue for Pakistan. And UNDRR, OCHA and the START network have worked very closely together to pilot the checklist earlier this year. In order for humanitarian action to be risk-informed and to help build resilience, it's no surprise that it needs to be inclusive, accessible and locally led. Diverse community leadership plays a really critical role in designing and implementing disaster risk reduction efforts. Yet, unfortunately, local actors are not always able to work in an enabling environment, provided sufficient resources and capacities. And this is particularly true for those working to support people most at risk. Aisha, what's your experience working in a challenging and complex environment of having to engage local actors in disaster risk reduction in Pakistan? How have you, through the START network, really tried to engage in making sure that humanitarian action at the local level is risk informed? Over to you, Aisha.
Thank you so much. Yes, so here in Pakistan, especially given the experience of my own organization, we've always been working through local NGO partners. Now, given the work that we've done with START as a host organization for START, we are working very closely with local organizations who are primarily grassroots organizations and are members of the platform that we've created under the Disaster Risk Financing Facility. These organizations are at the forefront of the disaster, where the disaster is actually happening. WHH and START believe that the involvement of these local actors, their contextual knowledge, especially of the existing spectrum of vulnerabilities, makes them an essential part of the solution. In terms of engaging them, what we've done is we have various technical working groups that are set up. We have very regular meetings where all these members are invited. Local organizations are heard. We know what kind of issues they are facing, what kind of disasters or what kind of anticipatory response is expected in that particular area. And then we have already preset agreements or preset criteria set out for what kind of responses would be done by individual actors in the areas that they've already earmarked. In terms of engaging the local actors directly and indirectly, it attains particular significance, especially in the various programs that we've been doing, for which START network is currently a build-up of. And I think the most important thing here is the multitude or the variety of resources that is put in for these initiatives, especially if we talk about the Building Disaster Resilience Program, for instance, that we've already run, the German Foreign Office funded Together program, which is working on capacity building. So I think collectively, all of that has really helped us to engage the local actors at all levels and at all tiers. Thank you.
Aisha, thank you so much. And it's a very timely reminder that local engagement isn't accidental, is it? It must be deliberate. And it's the first step in making sure that our efforts in addressing humanitarian needs and risk reduction are contextual, are relevant, and are owned by the local community. Ali, I wonder if you could share your screen, please. We're going to cross to menti.com. And for those of you who are answering either on your phone or by using the link in the multimedia or in the chat box, I can see that the answers are starting to come in. So we're asking you to respond to the question, what are the greatest challenges facing local actors who are working to scale up disaster risk reduction in humanitarian action? And Aisha, we can see a range of different answers there, from access to funding, to policies, predictable funding, lack of funding, financing. I can sense a certain theme emerging here. Aisha, what's been your experience do you see the answers that you would supply here on the screen?
Absolutely. I think most of them are already answered, and I think it's good to know that people are already thinking at the same, people are already thinking the same way to make sure that the local actors are engaged at most levels. I think the more key word here for me would be sustainable partnerships, capacity development, combined decision-making, joint parameters of risk thresholds. I think that would be the key things here for us when we're looking at a holistic response in this context.
And we see here that funding, technical capacity is being highlighted. Ali, can you scroll down the screen a little if that's possible? Yeah, policies and funding, unclear mandate, competing priorities. I'm really interested to get to the bottom of the one that says here, international and national interventions focused on discussions rather than tangible outputs. Aisha, in your experience from moving from concept or understanding a need, moving from concept to actual implementation, what's required to get that process happening? And importantly, what's required to keep that process happening? Because I note here that another participant has called out often the short-term nature of our response mechanisms. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience there?
I would again say sustainable partnerships and collaboration over longer terms, right? You don't just start engaging with local partners or local actors, or even start looking at resources at the time you really need them. They need to be available before that. And I think that is what we've been able to do in START. The resources have been there before the requirement was there, so people already knew what form of resources they could kind of tap into. I think that is very important. The access of local organizations and even other partners, this is a two-way process, right? So the local organizations bring in indigenous knowledge. They bring in a lot of a lot of local coping mechanisms that are existing, and then the technology that is there with other programs or other initiatives. I think combined, both of them bring through what we really need in terms of making sure that all actors or challenges are well informed. I think the key challenge here is also the level of information that is disseminated. And I think that needs to be equal at all levels. It needs to be consistent at all levels so that people are all informed on what kind of anticipatory response, for instance, or what kind of disaster is in the wake and how people need to plan better for it. So I think the key here is collaboration, continued information sharing, and sustainable partnership, along with, of course, making sure that resources are available over a longer period of time.
Aisha, when you're talking about information sharing, what kind of information are you talking about there? Risk-related information, program-related information, community? What can you elaborate on that a little for us?
So I'd say it would be a composite of all. Primarily, in order to make sure that the communities are ready, it would be risk-related information at the first step. But based on that, how do people really make sure that they are ready to be able to respond to that? Then it would mean what kind of activities that need to be there. Then it would also mean capacity building for those actors who are going to be responding to that particular kind of anticipatory response. But above all, I think most of it is also to do with how do they better use the resources that are available at hand, and that not all resources need to be financial when you're responding as well.
I've got one final question for you, Aisha, and just a reminder to our guests today and audience, feel free to use the Q&A function on WebEx to type in any questions that you've had that have been raised by our panelists' remarks today. You're very welcome, and I'll filter those Q&As out. One final question, Aisha, and just a heads up, Nurun, it would also be useful that we discuss this too. I can see capacity mentioned often, lack of capacity, strengthening capacity. Capacity is a very broad word. In your experience, what types of capacities need to be strengthened? Where are those capacity gaps?
I think it also depends on what kind of area you're working in. And if I talk in the context of Pakistan, here the type of disasters are very diverse over the geographic spread that we have. And if you look at the way individual disasters are addressed or individual disasters are responded to, I think a lot of that is lost with the type of capacity, because of the sustainability individual organizations have. So I think one of the key things here, one of the key challenges for the civil society here in Pakistan is also how to retain the human resource who is already aware on how to make sure that things are responded in time. I think that would be the first capacity. The other one would be having appropriate systems in place. By systems, I mean what kind of systems would be required for anticipatory responses, what would be required for a huge emergency that has suddenly taken place, what do we really need to do, what is going to be in place, what are the policies that are going to facilitate them at the government level, at the regional level, at the local level, what are the resources that people can tap into. I think having access or having knowledge or the capacity of what people can do, how to make sure that the local resources are used. I think that is also very important. I think that is a key struggle when we come to anticipatory responses here. And then also, you know, the understanding or the difference between in Pakistan specifically, there's a mindset. People understand emergencies, they understand a humanitarian response, but not a lot of people understand anticipatory response and what kind of activities would entail an anticipatory response. I think targeted capacity building for that is also required.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I think that last point you made is very relevant, and I'm already formulating a follow-up question for our next guest, Dr. Thomas Zahn-Eisen. Just putting you on notice there. We've just had a brief look into the local context in Pakistan. It's always important to understand what policymakers are thinking, what funders and donors are thinking about scaling up DRR. And we know, Dr. Zahn-Eisen, that Germany was the second largest provider of humanitarian aid in 2020. And we can imagine that there are already feelings afoot in the German parliament about feeling the pinch with the domestic response to COVID-19. We've seen what's happened in the UK. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that, but we know that domestic budgets are shrinking in terms of aid, and yet humanitarian need is growing. And the German government has often spoken admirably of the need for preventative humanitarian aid. And we know that the consultations that led to the development of the checklist and recommendations we're discussing today have highlighted siloed financing as one of the main barriers that still remain, that prevents us from achieving a risk-informed humanitarian action. So my question, Dr. Zahn-Eisen, today is, what is Germany doing to break those funding silos and to enable humanitarian action to be risk-informed, including through innovative approaches such as anticipatory humanitarian action? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for having me, and thank you for organizing this very, very interesting session. Well, there are many questions in one, so I can only scratch hardly the surface of what you asked me for. Actually, I wanted to start with acknowledging the importance of these recommendations. I think they're truly important. We've been following this process for a long time, and we really think that the recommendation will help us to move the whole system forward in terms of strengthening the humanitarian dimension of disaster risk reduction. And I think this is a very, very important step that we have collectively taken. Well, I start with the beginning of your question, our funding. Well, it's kind of strange. In Germany and the parliament, humanitarian funding is not a big issue. In terms, it is understood that it is required, and there's hardly a situation where I get more pushed by the opposition for more money. So it's quite across the board a very positive support, but it comes with strings attached. They want us to do a better job collectively. And the one thing we've been focusing, but we've also been pushed by our public and by the parliament is, get the most efficient and the most effective system possible. And Reen has already very much explained the rationale. And one cornerstone of what we've been asked for is precisely a much more informed decision-making process based on analytical data, so that we can do things better, effectively, and also actually for the benefit of people. So this has been something where we have the full support, and I cannot remember a single issue where I've talked more in Parliament about than this specific point. So I think that there's broad support. Yes, breaking the silence, number two. Yeah, I think these recommendations will certainly contribute to helping breaking silos, because they're very concrete examples of what you can do. And I think DRR, as much as anticipatory action in general, because it is fact-based, it is quite a catalytic instrument for creating nexus discussions. Because let's not forget, somehow DRR is in the middle of humanitarian action and development world, so you can use it both ways. And we always discuss on the same set of good data, hopefully good data. So I think it can really have a catalytic effect for the whole system. Specifically on DDR, I think where we want to move next is, of course, what we expect now our human partners to do as a donor is that they really integrate DDR components in the humanitarian programming, not as an add-on, but systematically. And the other side of the coin, of course, is then that as a donor, we have to fund it. And we're ready to do that. And I'm quite hopeful that, and actually I can see that other humanitarian donors are also move in the right direction. So I think we cannot expect the system to do better on DRR, and the same applies to anticipatory action, of course, in the emergency situation, and not funding it. So we will go that way. It's a gradual process, but I think we're moving on this way. The second point was, what do we do for anticipatory action in general? I started it already. We have been focusing on one particular issue, which is anticipatory humanitarian action on a forecast-based financing model, which we apply mostly to weather-induced natural disasters. And we've started this, so it's flood, droughts. We have given some examples from Somalia. We started that 6 years ago with a couple of partners. I mentioned them later, and I think we have achieved a lot of traction, and now we have more than 100 initiatives in 65 countries, and it's an integral part of funding mechanisms like the SURF, the TREF, the START Fund. So I think a lot has been changed, and we strongly believe that now, I think the point has been made that anticipatory action is possible, and it should be used. Having said that, I think what we still have to do is working on the predictive models, mainstream the models, and most importantly, scale up. I think just from the experience that we have from forecast-based financing, I think we have not even tapped a fraction of the potential that is in there yet. So I think a lot more can be done. And of course, it requires more financial scaling up as well, and we're ready to do that. The final point is on local ownership, because you mentioned it and Aisha mentioned it. What we learned from focus-based financing programs is very simple, and actually we saw the same in the humanitarian response to the COVID crisis. the local actors are more and more important for success. They're resilient, they're motivated, and actually for focus-based financing, and Aisha made the case very eloquently, they're actually the drivers. You know, they're not the add-ons, they are the owners and drivers of this process. And that's why we came to the conclusion a long time ago that it is not enough just to financially scale up the project themselves, but you have to invest in, it's a bad word, in the capacity. But actually what we want to invest is what Aisha said. We want to invest in long-term sustainable partnerships that we can address question of retention of staff. And this is something we really have to think better how to do it. But we have a good partners on our side, at least from the Foreign Office, which is the German Red Cross, especially the Red Cross Western Societies, and the whole START network with all their partners on the ground. So I think this is the way to invest, and then I think it will become a self-sustaining model where I think increasingly, at least for the anticipatory action part on focus-based financing, we can say that is increasingly driven by the countries and not by donors or NGOs. So I'm hopeful we move in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those considered remarks. And I think it's very refreshing to hear someone say that there is a parliament and a government very much in tune with the demands, not just domestic demands, but international demands, and fully committed to humanitarian funding. So thank you for renewing our trust in that area today. I want to cross now, Ali, if you can share your screen, please, to menti.com. Thomas, we've asked people to rank preferred financing solutions in the order of importance in terms of scaling up disaster risk reduction in humanitarian action. And just a reminder, if we can put the multimedia link from my team in the discussion so people can use that there, or if participants on your phones, you can go now to menti.com and fill that in. We can see that the first place from our audience today has gone to anticipatory action forecast-based financing. And then we're moving to microinsurance, climate finance, DRR-related aid, quality criteria, and other. I wonder, Thomas, if you'd like to respond to what you're seeing there, and if you feel that mirrors also your ranking. How would you have ranked these answers if you'd had the opportunity?
Well, to answer with Mark Twain, if you have a hammer, every solution is a nail. Is that what it says?
Yes.
So of course, as we are promoting very much the anticipatory actions through focus-based financing, I'm happy to see that number one. And I think, as I said, there's a huge potential, especially because it can be done so well at local level. And I think the externalities, the spillovers of this kind of approaches for local society is huge. And so I'm a big fan of it, but again, it is not sufficient. It is only one spectrum of a bigger approach, which also, of course, also includes insurances, climate finance, and the others. I think they're complementary, so I would not rank them in the sense that one is less important than the other. Again, they don't necessarily all address the same spectrum of activity. You know, when we do the humanitarian dimension, so we have to keep it needs-based. So some of the insurances are more complicated, but that's why we have a nexus discussion, look for partners from the World Bank, development partners to achieve all of them. But again, I think they're all necessary and all important.
Thomas, you were speaking, your remark there is that there's a time and a place for each of these approaches. But you also spoke earlier about the difficulty, the huge role that data plays for evidence-based decision, and the difficulty in getting data, particularly from some of the world's most complex environments. Is that something that feeds into your decision-making when you're thinking about where you put your funding? Could you elaborate a bit more on the importance of data, particularly around risk reduction in the humanitarian field?
Yes, I mean, again, I find it quite refreshing to see how much discussion you can have suddenly once you have a basis on which you can found a discussion, which is data. So I think we have to set up the data models. Again, an issue that far exceeds the humanitarian core mandate. But I think we have a couple of good assets. I think we invest very much in innovation, the anticipation hub from WFP, which is a model to streamline new analytical approaches. But I think there we really have to support a network of actors. You know, I see our role more as a funding stream, not so much as an organizer. But there seems to be a pretty self-sustaining model already, and we simply have to expand these models from one region to the next. I think we're not there geographically where we want to be. I think South Asia is pretty well covered right now. Horn of Africa, Southern Africa increasingly, but there are other regions out there which we need to cover as well if we want to tap the full potential.
Thank you very much for that frank response. I remember in my own career working in Somalia and being involved in capturing data around humanitarian needs. And one of the only ways that was possible in areas that were highly controlled by Al-Shabaab was over the phone. And we had a call center set up, and we would make hundreds of thousands of calls into Somalia to check what was happening, where the needs, is aid getting to the right people at the right time. And our call center operatives were on very strict guidelines. You know, it should take you 10 minutes. You've got to get through 100 people a day in 10 minutes. And I remember once looking over the call logs and seeing a spike in that someone had spoken to someone for 45 minutes, which was a risk also in Somalia, and completely then skewed how many calls we were able to do. And when following up with the call center operator, we said, why 45 minutes for this person? You know, you had 5 questions. Yes, Stephanie, but this person was a poet. And for me, that's a lovely reminder that we bring personal feelings and context to data. Yeah, and data, when it is not drilled down far enough, when we seek data from the wrong people at the wrong times, when data is not accurately used and then accurately applied, it can also lead us into very tricky places. So I just wanted to respond with a personal story and say we too at UNDRR, and I'm sure Ocha, our colleagues there too, recognise the primary importance of data and the people who sit at the heart of those numbers as well. Dr. Zarneisen, thank you very much for your contribution.
Just one word on, just to conclude, I think it is we are in a very dynamic, forward-looking model here, but I think we have to consolidate a lot. I think every time we use predictive models, we have to analyze, were we right, was the data right? So I think that we need as much consolidation of the data world as moving to new frontiers. So I think we very much focus also on consolidation, because the models have to be readjusted each and every time.
Yes, exactly right. And as we said, with people at the center of those. Thank you very much. Dr. Nuha, I'm going to cross to you now. Ali, you can stop sharing the screen. I'm just looking for my script now, which has also disappeared. Dr. Nuha Nurun, you're the Joint Chief of the Planning Commission in Bangladesh. And we wanted to continue along the government perspective, the policy perspective, particularly around the collaboration and policy perspective, bringing in the climate angle. We know that the Bangladeshi government has taken a very proactive approach to managing and reducing climate and disaster risks across humanitarian action and development planning, and including through your National Resilience Programme. And the government's leadership on scaling up DRR is reflected also on the humanitarian side, with the Humanitarian Coordination Task Team, which is co-led by the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, together with the UN. Can we ask you to give us your advice? What advice would you provide to other countries who are facing repeated humanitarian crises and who face complex underlying risk drivers, including climate change and poverty? What advice would you provide to other countries? And from a policy perspective, what do you think governments can do to ensure that emergency response and humanitarian action is informed by risk? Over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the nice question. Yes, and I think what you've been asking is also part of the answer. So I would like, I would be glad to inform that, you know, your first question, like what could other countries do? So for, you know, from the Bangladeshi experience that we've been managing disasters since last 50 years. and quite successful at it, but still many challenges in some of the some areas of disasters. And even the recent reports in 2009 says because of the climate change and the multiple hazards, at least 77% of our population are at risk of different hazards and climate change. And along with that, the COVID-19 pandemic, that has added on the disaster management scenario. But we've been successful in managing by taking whole of the society approach. So I would like to stress on the fact the whole of the society approach, even in the COVID-19 pandemic, our government at the first instance gave out the relief to the COVID affected people in the pockets where poor people were there, and by taking data and everything. So I think it covered at least 70 million people. It was termed a successful approach. So the whole of society approach, and having a good standard policies in place. For example, as you mentioned, the Minister of Disaster Management and Relief, which is which has the mandate to carry out the humanitarian activities. So Planning Commission, what it does the overall national planning, development planning, based on 5-year plans to ensure the economic growth is sustained, other long-term visions. But it supports the ministry's programs in terms of their own projects, investments. So we try to ensure that the ministry or the institute that is responsible for the humanitarian organization, could be one or many, gets the right kind of support in terms of new investments or in terms of recurring expenditure. So that Planning Commission does, even for the NRP, National Resilience Program. We are trying to, it is a partnership, because partnership issue has been mentioned by our panelists here. It is a partnership program with 4 ministries: the Minister of Disaster, Minister of Planning, Women Affairs, and local government. So that is a key thing. So whether we are checking whether their capacity is not falling or the gaps are being fulfilled, although we are getting the money relief across the humanitarian for the humanitarian activities, but need to ensure the capacity of the institute that is mainly responsible for it. And I would like to stress on adaptive social protection. We have a lot of social safety programs. So it is now this concept, adaptive social protection, where we take both poverty and climate risk together to address the risk, the community at risk. And it's been very successful. And as I mentioned, we have the guidelines, humanitarian guidelines, that is understanding orders of disaster. It is applicable across the ministries, including planning division and other ministries, what they will do. And so if all the ministries can act properly based on the national guidelines, and that will be very helpful. And so we have to be on guard and checking and monitoring ourselves whether we ourselves are prepared. Of course, keeping aside the humanitarian activity. And another 2 points I would like to suggest is the localization of disaster risk reduction and humanitarian response. So, and to enhance the community capacity and empowerment in building resilience. So, we've been talking about disaster risk reduction. So we have to know the local aspects of that. So of course, disaster strikes at a local area at a particular point, and it's very different in the north. The disaster on the north side is different from our south side, and so we have to get that that local aspects of the DRR. And targeting of the people, of course, the humanitarian activities means proper targeting, as you were mentioning with the Somalian example. So how can we improve that? That's where I think problem lies. Yes, we have maybe we have the human resources, other resources and the finance, but are we giving it to the right people? So proper targeting can be done by our strong databases, which we are improving. So maybe the countries could have good databases of the risk communities, the communities at risk, Risk maps, a long time ago, we produced community risk assessment report that were very helpful for the local governments. In Bangladesh, we also have local governments up to the ward level, the district, upazila, union, and ward. And so understand in the risk maps, we need national risk maps. So we are trying to do in Planning Commission produce risk maps that are a combination of the vulnerability, hazards, and exposure, that is evidence-based. So I'm not so keen on the you were saying personal context. That is also very important when you go down there. But at the national level, we have to have evidence-based risk maps or risks information, so that we can identify the proper DRR method, disaster risk reduction intervention. So which DRR we need to be in place, or we need to roll out now, so that before the next humanitarian crisis appears. Thank you.
Dr. Nahar, thank you very much. I want to cross to the Menti question now, if we can. Ali, if you can share your screen, because I think this picks up on one of the topics that you were talking there from that coordination aspect. Risk is complex. We know that it's becoming more and more compound in nature too. Systemic in terms of disasters cascading and becoming interconnected. But as we've seen with COVID-19, we have COVID-19, extreme weather emergencies, socioeconomic collapse. We have compound disasters of many shapes and forms occurring simultaneously. So we know that we can't take a siloed approach in our response. The question we've asked our audience today is who are the actors that need to be involved to successfully mainstream DRR in policy and planning? And you can see some of the answers are here. We've seen private sector networks, business community, local governments, municipal authorities, parliamentarians, Red Cross national societies, considering people locally who are implementing DRR, citizens, yes, representatives from key. Nurun, when you're seeing this broad universe of actors, I guess this is telling us one thing, isn't it? That everybody must be involved. But how do you make sure that everybody's involved?
Yes, I think I agree with what I'm seeing on the screen. It has to be across the spectrum of the people. As I mentioned, I think a whole of society approach. And also, I think I mentioned like a key policy that is acceptable to all, the standing orders on disaster. So, that is approved by our Prime Minister. And that has outlined what would each of these stakeholders will do. So it starts with our local leaders, local government leaders, to our disaster experts, to our parliamentarians. I think most of them are there, even the faith community. So we have the mosques and the mandirs, and even the mosques, the imams are asked to play the role in the, the post-disaster, at least in the post-disaster aspects or issues. And community leaders are also, I think everyone is there, because disaster is not as a single sector thing, and it is a multi-sectoral, and it affects whole of the country. As I said in the beginning, 79% of our population at risk lives in the hazard escape and at risk of different disasters. Mm-hmm. So I think my answer would be to involve everyone, because that means if I involve them, government gets the benefits of accumulating the resources of all these knowledge across the different stakeholders. So that is an added benefit to the government if we can gather all these stakeholders in the humanitarian response. And of course, so that will mean the DRR policy, of course, it will be government-led, but of course backed by the support from our experts, community leaders, and NGOs, civil societies, and of course our development partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction squarely says that governments hold primary responsibility for reducing risk because of their duty of care. But it says importantly that all stakeholders are involved because risk is everybody's business. And it's grateful for your reminder and also for the example you've given us, at least at that policy coordination level, how important it is to have all perspectives round the table, so that therefore not just response and the humanitarian action side of things is appropriately dealt with, but scaling up DRR before the humanitarian crisis occurs is also appropriately planned for. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to Jerry Chandler now, who's our fourth panelist. Thanks for the questions I can see in the Q&A box. We are going to have time to get to those. And I can see a question there also in the chat around the responsibility of regional organizations, not just funders, local communities and governments, but the responsibility of regional organizations. I can see a question about that speaks to the invisibility of risk and that prevention work is largely, it's very difficult to demonstrate good prevention work, because if prevention work is good, then the risk doesn't manifest. Yeah, its outcomes are invisible. There's a question there about how can we get donors more interested in anticipatory actions in DRR. And there's also a question on the importance of the nexus. Two questions on that: how DRR can effectively bridge, as we spoke about earlier today, humanitarian action and the prevention, and the development world. So I will come to the speakers with those questions. I'm just giving you a heads up so that you can prepare. But Jerry, I'm going to cross to you now. I trust that we've got a better connection. I know that we won't be able to see you on video, but I hope that we can hear you. Jerry, can you just say hi to all of us, and then I'll be able to test your audio. Can you hear us, and can you say hi? Can I just get an indication, please, from one of my team members? Jerry, can you just tell us your role, please, and where you're speaking to us from? Jerry, I'm really sorry to interrupt. Please forgive me, but I'm afraid that the audio connection is not strong enough. We can't hear you. Can I just ask, Paula, are you also experiencing a bad audio connection? You're the only face I can see at the moment. Yeah, okay. Jerry, I'm really sorry. I will check back with you in 5 minutes to see if you've got a better connection, but I think at this moment it's not possible for us to hear you. I want to instead go to the Menti screen, where, Jerry, I can see you. Can you try again?
Hello, Stephanie, can you hear me now?
Ah, yes. You're in business. Yay. Fantastic. And lovely to see your face. I'm going to strike while the iron is hot. Right. You're calling in from Haiti, where of course we're still where we've just finished the piloting of the checklist. And we wanted to talk with you today about the importance of risk knowledge and risk information. Could you give us your perspective on who you think needs to be engaged to fully risk-inform humanitarian planning in Haiti, and how can humanitarian and development partners better work together to ensure that planning is informed by an understanding of disaster risk? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Hello to everyone. As said, introduced, I am talking to you from Haiti, and it is a pleasure for me to be part of the HWPN this year again, and to talk about those various issues. So directly to the question, Stephanie. Actually, we just finished the piloting phase of the checklist, and we are moving and we're doing like what we call the lessons learned, so we can enhance and prepare for the next steps. So basically, a few of my fellow panelists have mentioned a few of those questions that should be addressed in regards to moving forward with the checklist. But basically, from our experience here in Haiti, what the real question is, as the question mentions, is the real involvement of various key actors. I think in the beginning, when we had the introduction to the whole panel, there was a mention of the conclusions that were made, that were taken from the experience of the piloting. And one of these conclusions is a better involvement of actors, especially state-led actors, the protection civil per se, and some of those key participants in the DRR arena. But also one of the issues was the lack of coordination, or the lack of understanding and communication between the actors. So right about now, the real conclusion, the real answer to this is really the involvement of those specific stakeholders. Let me start internally, because as a state and government representative, I think we need to start from within. And the real issue right now is to really educate the decision makers and the policymakers. At my stage, in my position as the disaster manager, I have to make sure that all the main key holders, especially the sector leaders, agriculture, environment, and public works, and so forth and so on, are really educated about DRR and know exactly what the expectations are. Haiti is a nation that is prone to disaster. We are in the track of hurricanes, and we are, how would I say, circled by fault lines. So right now, they need to know exactly what it means and what the risks are, so that when those risks materialize and then protection civil comes up and requires their support to move forward, so they know exactly what it is, and it's not at that time that they'll be asking questions or wondering what to do. One of the key actors that also need to be involved is finances, and this is one of the issues that we have faced, and we tend to neglect them since they're not operational, quote unquote, but they are really essential to the success of what we need to do. And again, the work that needs to be done both in terms of right now, more so ever than in prevention and mitigation than response, because as you mentioned previously, a better preparation and prevention equals better response and less spending and more economy and more strengthening. So from the government perspective, that's that. And also one of the things that we're really focusing and pushing with is the involvement of the private sector, because right now we're getting the private sector on board and not working, and we try not to work with the private sector as what they call a piggy bank, where we just request from them funds and resources and not give them something back. Whereas what we're trying to do, trying to get them involved in the preparation phases so that they can participate in mitigation programs, do correct investments, so that when we are in a situation that requires them to be actors as well, so they can, join in and understand that they have a stake in investing in DRR, so that they can minimize the impact of the disasters on their businesses and their activities. Last but not least is the community engagement, of course, because we need to make sure that we inform the people, because it starts with them. If they don't know what's going on, if they know what to do, we can do all of the nice things that we are trained to do. It's not going to work, because we need to have impact, and we need their participation to help us move forward and help us get those decision makers to move to get on board. So in regards to the humanitarian community, their involvement really stands and is really important in the fact that we really need to streamline and have coordinated effort, especially in mitigation, because in Haiti we have we know that we have had this a story of actors getting involved here and there, doing various actions, but that are not connected and coordinated. So therefore you end up having duplications, and you have a quote unquote waste of resources. So right now the real issue is to communicate freely, frankly, know who's doing what, so we, protection civil, can actually do a real mapping of what those actions are and use and utilize those resources more, in the most efficient way possible. So all in all, if the short answer to the question is, who needs to get involved? Everyone. Now we do have priorities that I just outlined, and those priority actors, of course, we need to ping and focus on them in order to get them on board. But of course, like I said, it's a collective work, and it's a big effort that needs to keep going so we can get to where we need. Because indeed, like you mentioned, we have to look at the Sendai framework goals and objectives so we can align and, you know, be at a better stage for the future.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Jerry. It was refreshing to hear the private sector mentioned and not just as a piggy bank. I want to go now to menti.com. You'll see this come up on the screen to see whether our audience has anything to let us know about the challenges to accessing risk knowledge. We've talked about the fact that everybody needs to be involved. We've talked about with different participants today about the challenges around evidence-based decision making, having the right information at the right time. And I wanted to see, Jerry, whether you have any reflections here and whether any of the challenges that our guests today are putting on the screen, if they resonate with you. What, you know, when you think about accessing risk knowledge and making sure that it makes that critical jump between understanding and being incorporated in decision making, what are the challenges you've seen? I can see here, okay, communication, capacity, commitment. I like the 3 C's. Users' capacity to interpret and use the knowledge based on context, making reports and information accessible to everyone. Jerry, you can see the same answers I can. Any reflections
Absolutely.
there?
Absolutely. And all of these, most of these, if not all of them, remarks are absolutely, as they say, on point, because they reflect the real issues that we face on the ground. But one of the points that really appeals to me is decision makers rotations, and this is one of the things that I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, in the sense that every now and then, our experience here is that every now and then you do have new people at the helm of different organizations that need to know what they need to do, and if they're not informed, we get into trouble because we don't have we cannot have the answer that we need so we can keep moving forward. So the 3 C's, of course, yes, it is very important to actually be able to push with that. Public and accessible information, yes, is one of the things that that is an issue to us and that we need to really push forward with. Again, I'm coming back to the implication of local communities and also private sector, because those to me are really one of, I would say, witnesses in our case, and I think those are things that need to be addressed as priorities, because again, like I said, the network, the disaster is the DRR arena is a network, and we all need to play our role and all need to play our part so that the whole cycle can be completed, and once the disaster strikes, we can be at a better position to answer and to be able to do correct response to whatever happens. Over to you.
Jerry, thanks. I also take note that there's a point there that someone's made about linking up systems, information systems as well, and making sure that we have cohesive and interoperable data, which is critical. I think that issue of access is really resonant. I'm going to open back up to our panelists. If you feel free to all of our panelists today, if you want to switch your cameras on, because we do have 3 questions in the Q&A and we have time. So I think there's a question here being asked by Lisa Zauerhammer, which is really picking up on the point around humanitarian and development sectors and DRR as potentially the bridge. I'm just going to read it out. That Lisa's happy that she's seeing the humanitarian development nexus mentioned quite prominently, and she's wondering about if you could share ideas on concrete steps that could improve the humanitarian development nexus in DRR, particularly making it easy to deal with the challenges that humanitarians are facing, you know, comprehensive risk assessments, addressing underlying risks, and building sustainable local partnerships and collaboration in very short time periods. I'm very happy for any panelists to jump in and address this, but if you could keep your answer very brief and focus on concrete steps that would help improve that nexus. Any panelists happy to have a look at this question? Nurun, please.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd just like to maybe give a suggestion to or answer. For example, Bangladesh is trying to implement disaster impact assessment. You know, there are 3 things you mentioned here for the, linking between the humanitarian and the DRR. So first, I think it's understandable it has to be government-led approach, because when, disaster strikes. But before that, we need to know where our disaster risks are. So at least for a public investment, and also help the private sector investments through tools such as disaster impact assessment. That is a simple tool that the planners of the department ministries doing the big projects that are, DRR sensitive or climate change adaptation sensitive. We can help them to use this tool with the information base that you mentioned before. So DIA, disaster impact assessment, if we can do that in our planning process, so we'll have that knowledge, and each of the big investments will have that knowledge and also understand the residual risk that come up in a risk. Can we know all the types of risk information? I know there might be risks of something, but can we have information on all the risks? So even if we, so those kind of information might help us. So I think DIA tool will be very helpful in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's also an interesting project happening in Africa at the moment that UNDRR is involved in around transboundary risk and understanding transboundary risk, and then pulling those risks into a risk knowledge system that governments can access to feed into decision making. And I think there are a couple of very concrete projects on the ground, particularly around risk-based assessments, community assessments. Aisha, I wonder if I can come to you now, because I want to pick up on Lisa also put a second question in, which I think is dealing with that age-old conundrum about where does humanitarian response stop and development kick in? And that, in fact, we face many dynamic contexts, don't we, in these days? Aisha, do you have anything to add to that question of where does humanitarian stop and development begin when we know that most of it is overlapping? Aisha, over to you.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question. If you look at the humanitarian response, look at this from a different perspective. I mean, a lot of times, most of the humanitarian donors also say that, most of the risks, particularly in Pakistan, are more governance related, hence they are more developmental in nature and not humanitarian at all. And I think what we need to do to make sure that they're interlinked is whether we are doing things from the humanitarian lens, we have to link them through to what it is going to mean when our humanitarian response, for instance, is going to stop. If there is immediate response that is taking place, I mean, before immediate response, there is anticipatory response, then there is responding to the disaster if the disaster has taken place, and then there is a recovery after that. And I think that is the bridging period that would link disasters to actual development projects. And I think from our own perspective and from our own experience, I think it is all about continuity. I think once you start responding to disasters and you really want your response to be linked to development, you make sure that you're finding adequate resources to be there in that particular area or with that community who has been affected by disaster over a longer cycle, so that you see them through to the round till the time, for instance, there is the possibility of a next disaster happening. And I think that is how you make sure that they're interlinked.
The life cycle approach. Thank you very much. Thomas, if I can come to you, there's a question from Tarek who says that indicators of humanitarian response outcomes are easier to measure with traditional cycle of disaster response and restore, and therefore funds are easier to be justified. What you can see, you can fund, I guess. How can donors be encouraged to invest in anticipatory actions and DRR activities? What's the mindset around humanitarian action that has DRR integrated within as making it as present within the donor community? Is there more communication needed on this front? You made some comments around efficiency and effectiveness in your opening remarks, but I wonder if you want to address Tarek's question here. Over to you.
Yes, I mean, what we say, of course, there's almost an instinct in the humanitarian world that you see an emergency and you have to invest in the emergency because there's visible suffering. And I think but at the same time, we have to invest in the system to make it better. And this is one of the key ways of doing this is precisely the way anticipatory action, just a better functioning system. And and we get from limited resources, financial resources, the maximum output. And I always make the point, efficiency, effective, yes, but also we have to make, this is a moral obligation. that we invest in these predictive models because we avoid suffering. So even if it wasn't effective and efficient, we ought to do it because we avoid suffering. I mean, anybody in Bangladesh or Pakistan who is hit by a flood and we can evacuate in 2 days ahead, I think we have the moral obligation to do that. So I think it is nothing, this is not a toy, this is an obligation. And I think everybody intuitively understands it in Parliament, and we say, listen, we need money for the system to get better. We have to invest. It's not a free system where everything gets better for free. And so I think that works. There's always a challenge with preventive operation, because it's like in healthcare, you know, if you're not sick, why did you go to the doctor? But here it's different, because here we can measure the success. We can see how much less money we need. They made the example. So I think we have strong arguments, and I think that's why I think it is not difficult to convince publics and other donors to come in. We're trying hard with donor outreach with other partners, and I think movement, the more particularly smaller donors think of coming in and investing in these models.
Yes. Yes, and I think we see growing humanitarian needs. Estimated 20 million people at least thrust back into poverty just over the last 9 months of COVID-19 pandemic. We know that the system isn't working with this current preoccupation around respond, recover, that we've got to look at redressing that balance and looking at a prevention first agenda to relieve some of the need at that end. And I think it's really about balancing that that seesaw and putting the money where we see results. And I think that's one of the really great things about this checklist. It doesn't have an either or approach. That's the whole point. It's really, how do we scale up a long-term risk reduction approach within the midst of meeting people's immediate needs so that this doesn't happen again. Yeah, and I think that's a really compelling drive for us all. Jerry, I want to cross to you before I move to our closing speaker, because I want to tackle this question about regional organizations and how they work. So beyond local, beyond government, but in your experience, how do regional organizations play a role in effectively scaling up risk reduction in humanitarian action? Over to you, Jerry.
Well, I can say that there's been a very interesting evolution of the involvement of regional organization in the DRR environment, especially in Haiti, and if we're talking regional, the Caribbean, because and I'm referring right now to the role and the growing role and the evolution of CDMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Association. So we've been in contact with them, we've been working with them, and there's been a very good implication of that organization within all of the actions that are being done in the DRR arena. So the interest about this is that CDMA does not only address the issues of response, but also now gets involved in mitigation prevention, and they do that. The organization does that by creating and fostering networking with bigger quote unquote organizations that play key roles in the various islands that we have in the Caribbean. So again, that organization, and I mentioned CDMA, like I said, because it is really the organization with which we have the most experience with. But the integration is very good because, as we just mentioned, it is not it is a bipolar approach. We work on disasters, we work on response, but also at the same time we work, strategically speaking, on disaster risk reduction with by fostering programs, by fostering projects that fall within the big mandate that we have in the Senate network. So all of those these 17 participating governments coalesced, and we are, like I said, working together so that we can push and move forward, so we can have so we can strengthen the area, the Caribbean as a whole, in terms of disaster risk reduction. And it is a very positive initiative. Yes.
Thanks, Jerry. A timely reminder that it's not either or, it's with with against our common foe in multi-hazards. I'm going to welcome to this discussion Ricardo Minaspec, who's the director of UNDRR. Ricardo, I know that you've had a front row seat in responding to many humanitarian crises, and I wonder if you would give us the privilege, please, and pleasure of summing up today's discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, Steph, very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues. I would like to thank you all for joining us today at the launch of the checklist and recommendations on scaling up disaster risk reduction in humanitarian action. Special thanks, of course, to the panelists for the very good presentations and discussion that has followed. It has been very good to see the high level of participation and great interest in the topic. The interest in disaster risk reduction is not surprising at this moment in time. The climate emergency and of course the COVID-19 pandemic have demonstrated the changing pace and scale of risk. Risk is systemic, it's interconnected, and it's cascading. Demographic changes and unsustainable development choices mean that today more people than ever are more exposed and vulnerable to hazards. The pandemic and its social and economic implications on top of protracted conflict, climate-induced drought, and other disasters occurring simultaneously have thrown back millions of people into poverty. For all of us, the pandemic is a wake-up call. We need to take action to prevent crises, to prepare better for complex risks that have ripple effects across sectors and stop institutions from performing their central roles. Yet we are missing still key opportunities to ensure that development and humanitarian actions are informed by risk. We have the evidence that prevention saves lives as well as costs. We have the technology and risk information to anticipate disasters, but we are still not doing enough on prevention. Throughout my career, I have been convinced that humanitarian actors are particularly well placed to identify the disaster risk reduction actions that can be put in place to reduce risk and strengthen resilience in the disaster-affected communities. This is because disasters actually make vulnerabilities quite evident. And I have witnessed this myself through engagement in over a dozen UN humanitarian relief missions, as Steph was mentioning. If I may briefly share an anecdote, when leading an UNDRR mission in a country affected by a hurricane in the Caribbean region many years ago, many houses had lost their roof because wind-resistant building codes were not being enforced. We were able to provide them roofing materials accompanied by simple and graphic guidelines on how to build back better and help the community get out of the vicious cycle of disaster response, recover, and repeat. So what we want to do with this checklist is that reducing the risk of disaster is really everyone's business. And I think that this has been highlighted by all the panelists. In 2015, as we all know, member states signed up the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and they committed to better understand risk and invest in improved early warning systems, as well as in training and preparing for disasters. Those efforts have really paid off. For example, we know that mortality from weather-related disaster has significantly decreased thanks to better preparedness and early warning. We have heard more good news here today from you, the panelists. Well, first, our colleagues from OCHA and the ISC partners have developed detailed guidance on risk analysis in recent years, and we hope the checklist can complement these tools and help accelerate progress. We have heard also local actors, such as in Pakistan, are driving solutions to reduce vulnerability and overall risk and needs. The START network and others are at the forefront of scaling up such good practices. We are seeing a big push for the humanitarian system to anticipate rather than react. Advances in anticipatory action and forecast-based financing, such as those highlighted by Germany and OCHA, need to continue. We need more of these solutions, and bigger, faster. The Crisis Lookout Coalition is one example of the type of partnerships needed to take this to the next level. I also welcome the interest from our partners to increase their portfolio for disaster risk reduction and forecast-based financing to make prevention and the systemic integration of DRR into the humanitarian programming cycle possible. We have heard about how humanitarian and development actors are working more together. Governments like Bangladesh are leading the way in making this happen. In Afghanistan, joint risk analysis is informing not only the humanitarian response, but also wider efforts to strengthen social protection. In Haiti, and I was very pleased to see Jerry on the screen, some temporary relief camps have become permanent neighborhoods designed to withstand future hazards. We also see how UN agencies are breaking silos, as mentioned by Dr. Sandheisen. And we are working together to understand systemic risk and to create the next generation of multi-hazard early warning tools. Applying this information early and pre-agreeing finance can help save lives. Scaling up prevention will not happen automatically, of course. We need a paradigm shift along with more deliberate efforts across the board, like risk-informed programming and financing, improving coordination, and better risk data and analysis. We hope that you will find the checklist a useful tool and share it in your networks. Finally, I extend UNDRR's gratitude to OCHA, of course, my colleagues that have been engaged in developing this, and all partners for being part of this initiative. Thank you to all of you for your time, particularly to our panelists for sharing their experiences today. Thank you very much, and back to you, Steph.
Ricardo, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks also to you, our guests, for sticking with us until the end. We're wrapping up right now. I wanted to thank our four distinguished panelists today for your frankness, for your willingness to take questions off the floor and off the cuff and respond. And I wanted to thank you too, our participants and audience, for participating and sharing your thoughts with us today. Very quickly, what are the next steps? The next steps will include a development of a training package to support this checklist, a series of briefing notes on key themes of relevance to humanitarian action, and of course, we will look for opportunities to organise regional events on topics related to this topic later on this year. The checklist 2.0 will be included in the Humanitarian Programme Cycle in 2022 in their package and training and shared with humanitarian country teams. So those of you who are joining us today from humanitarian country teams on the ground, you will have access to this. And of course, you've seen the links in the chat. So please avail yourself of those and collect your document online. Thank you so much for staying with us. We look forward to you continuing to partner with us as we look to scale up disaster risk reduction in humanitarian action to make the planet a safer place for all of us. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Thanks. Great moderation, Stephanie. Thank you.
Yes, it was an honor. Thank you.